Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We also host a Clubhouse every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern, and this week, along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we explore the sanctification of powerlessness in Rabbinic Judaism and the internalization of failure. We discuss the tendency of Jews to seek fault in themselves as part of a harmful pattern that gave rise to anti-Semitism. We explore the writings of modern-day scholars who suggest a paradigm shift following the incommensurable tragedy of the Holocaust and the unprecedented rebirth of the State of Israel. So throw away your sackcloth and gird your loins as we explore Tisha B'av and the birth of anti-Semitism. And that brings us to our next question. What are you going to be talking to your congregation about, either on Shabbat or on Tisha B'av or both?
I'm going to tell you, tomorrow at least, I'm going to give them a sermon that was written by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in 1855. And in 1855, Samson Raphael Hirsch in Germany, the Orthodox Rabbi in Germany, talked about a preacher who 20 years earlier, means a rabbi, a Reform rabbi, who had ordered his congregation on Tisha B'av night to wear their finest, most beautiful clothing and to come and to celebrate on Tisha B'av night in the synagogue. Because he believed that mourning was over. There's no place for self-evaluation and for mourning and for thinking about the past. It was a time of emancipation, of hope. Hirsch's entire sermon was why that was wrong. That it's exactly when you're doing well that you need to be humbled and you need to fast on Tisha B'av.
So that really ties into some of the things that I'm going to be discussing.
So we're perfect.
That's perfect. I remember one summer I was at Camp Torah Vodas for Tisha B'av, and my dad came up with a friend to visit me, and we were sitting on the floor with ashes.
Really?
Yeah. And he, from his perspective, it was probably very similar to when Franz Rosenzweig walked into a shul for Kol Nidre right before he,
Yeah, that's funny.
It was so dramatic. He always used to talk about it. And clearly, it is very dramatic. You would think walking into a typical traditional synagogue on Tisha B'av, that something terrible happened last week, not 1900 years ago.
That's right, not 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. And I think the night that my dad came, it was thundering and lightning. And
so it was really dramatic.
It was very dramatic indeed. That's a good segue to say welcome to Madlik, and we are Disruptive Torah every week at 4 o'clock Eastern. And we are recording, and therefore this recording will go onto the Madlik podcast, which typically gets published on Sunday and becomes part of the record. So welcome all of you, and that's not to inhibit any discussion. It just means that what you say will go down into posterity. So we normally talk about the portion of the week that is read in synagogues on a particular week of Shabbat. And this week we have the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, which is begun in the cycle. And we also have on Sunday Tisha B'av. So I had wanted to talk about Tisha B'av. It's something that I've been given a lot of thought about for the last few years. But as I was also studying the book of Deuteronomy, the very first verse and the very first comment by the traditional classical sources formed an amazing introduction to what I want to talk about. So you should know, whether you're a higher biblical critic or you're a classical scholar of Judaism, somehow or other the book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Torah, but somehow it's different. It has a different voice. It has a different perspective. The higher biblical critics thinks that it might have been even written at the time of Ezra during the Babylonian exile, and that'll become relevant later. But whether you believe that or not, it has a different function and a different purpose. And it recaps many of the things that were said in the prior four books of Moses. So in the Sifrei Devarim, it says, these are the words which Moses spoke, and it asks the obvious question. Well, Moses has been speaking for the last four books. So what do you mean to say these are the words that Moses spoke? And it says that we are there taught shahayu divrei tochachot, that the words in the book of Deuteronomy are words of rebuke. So even this classical source is questioning the purpose, the function, the intention of the book of Deuteronomy, and it's positing that the purpose of it is to rebuke, to check, to castigate or forewarn the Jewish people. And then in Devarim Rabbah, which is also a very old classical commentary, it adds to that. And it says, in the name of Rav Acha, the son of Rabbi Chanina, if you're going to rebuke the children of Israel, why have Moses do it? Why have a friendly do it? Why wouldn't you have Bilam rebuke the children of Israel? Enemies are much better at criticism. And it answers that it was decided that because Moses loves them, he should rebuke them. Rather than to have the rebuke of our adversaries, if we're going to be held in check and account, let those who love us do it. So before we segue into the commemoration of the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'av that contains many texts of rebuke, I just want to open it up to conversation, Rabbi, in terms of the purpose of Devarim, the answer that the insight that I brought from these classical sources. Where do you stand?
First of all, Shabbat Shalom, and it's exciting. We're beginning the fifth book of the Torah, and that's always exciting. And Devarim has been a problem, literally, since the beginning of time. Exactly what is the role of Devarim? And that midrash that you quoted, that classical source that you quoted, which tells us that Devarim is different because it's rebuke, because it's tochacha, is really a very interesting idea. Because it really talks about, I think, Geoffrey, what the role of Moshe is. Is Moshe a defender of the people, or is Moshe a rebuker of the people? And then let me just raise that a step. Maybe being a rebuker is also part of being a defender. Maybe if I want to defend you, sometimes I have to be willing to rebuke you. So maybe that's really the tension here in Devarim. And that's what exactly is Moshe's role. At the end of his life, this is the last 30 days of his life. At the end of his life, what is his job? Rebuker, defender, or are rebuker and defender really two sides of the same coin?
I think that's, a great question. And obviously, we feel like we've been living with Moses. So many of the previous podcasts were where he was totally surprised, totally undermined by the people that he really carried out of Egypt. There's a real dialectic here between the leader and the flock, so to speak. And so I do think that's a great question. I wanted to give an example of what one would mean by rebuke, or at least the way I take it, from something that everyone who is at all familiar with the prayer book would be aware. The iconic Shema prayer begins with the call to faith, Shema Yisrael, and then the first paragraph that we say is all about you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. And by the way, that comes from Deuteronomy. But then the second paragraph that we say starts out in the same way, that you should do it with all your heart and soul. But then in Deuteronomy 11:16, it says, take care not to be lured away to serve other gods and bow to them. For the Lord's anger will flare up against you, and he will shut up the skies so that there will be no rain, and the ground will not yield its produce, and you will soon perish from the good land that the Lord is assigning to you. And I think as I was trying to understand, because I never thought of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, as necessarily full of rebuke, what it seems to add to, it's not simply rebuke, but it gives a sense of the tenuous nature of the Israelites, the Jewish people on this land, the really conditional nature of it, and that if you misbehave, and if you don't follow the rules, and if you don't love your neighbor and take care of the widow and all that, you will be shucked out. You will be put into exile. And that, to me, again, is a perfect segue into a commemoration of the destruction of the temple, but it really was the destruction of the first and the second Commonwealth. It's where we lost our political independence. And sure enough, that is, I think, and I'd love to hear what you feel about it, Rabbi, that is the biggest leverage. That's the biggest stick that Moses, and Moses as the spokesman of God, is waving. That I'm taking you into the promised land. I might not be able to come with you, but be aware that if you do not fulfill your side of the bargain, you will be kicked out.
I would agree with you. It's interesting that exile is the classical punishment. And obviously that's true. And I think you see that's true because, Tisha B'av, what strikes me most about Tisha B'av, of all the traditions that we have, is the fact that according to tradition, both the first and the second temples were both destroyed on the 9th day of B'av. Let's be honest. What is the chance of that? What is the chance that both temples are going to be destroyed on exactly the same day? And I think the idea is that it kind of, the date is not what's so important. It's the idea of emphasizing the fact that exile is the ultimate punishment. That whenever bad things happen, whenever you don't behave properly, that you're going to be exiled. There's a wonderful midrash that says that the reason that the temple was destroyed on Tisha B'av is because when the spies came back from their trip to Israel and they gave a bad report, it says that the Jewish people cried that night. And it says, what is it? They cry that night. It says, "Vatisa kol ha'ida vayitnu et kolam vayivku." They cry, and the rabbis say about that you cried b'chiyah shel chinam. You cried an unnecessary cry because there was no reason for you to cry. You should have trusted in God. Vani ekba lachem b'chiyah lidorot. I'm going to establish a reason for you to cry. That's such a powerful idea. You cried for no reason. You cried that you were going to have to enter the land, and therefore, as a punishment, you now are going to have to be in exile. That's the punishment. Exile is always the punishment.
So I'd like to pick up on what you said about somehow the confluence of bad things on Tisha B'av, the first temple and the second temple. And we can, at that point, we can say, okay, it was a coincidence. But at the end of the day, more and more things started to happen bad for the Jewish people on Tisha B'av. And in a sense, it wasn't so much self-fulfilling prophecy. It is that word got out that this was the day of calamity. So if Yamach Shemam, the Nazis, wanted to beat the Jews, or there was a pogrom in the works, it was more likely than not that if it was around Tisha B'av, they would attack them on Tisha B'av. In the nomenclature, in the vernacular in Israel today, if you meet somebody and they have a long face, in Hebrew you don't say, what's with the long face? You say, what's with the Tisha B'av face? The current, I should say, newly elected president of Israel, Isaac or Bougie Herzog, coined a phrase. He was being critical of Netanyahu a number of years ago, and he was criticizing him for trying to scare and frighten the Jewish people and running a politics of fear and fright, and he called it the Tisha B'av syndrome. So even Jews and non-Jews who do not observe Tisha B'av, they understand what a Tisha B'av face is. They understand the import that it has for the Jewish people. So it's almost grown beyond the particular day. But you are right. It is, it's focused, and it's focused particularly on one type of calamity, and that is the Jewish people losing autonomy, losing political autonomy, and any control over their well-being and decisions that affect their life.
And I think that's a very powerful point. Really, really powerful. The idea of exile. We don't think, Geoffrey, today about exile much. When you think about a punishment to a country, you talk about losing your autonomy. You think about a country that doesn't do well, they're not going to be exiled. France is not going to be exiled from France. The UK is not going to be exiled from the UK. New Yorkers are not going to be exiled from New York. It's actually an idea that had its moment. I don't think exile is something that speaks to people the same way anymore. And that's why I think, and this is an interesting question, that when we talk about Tisha B'av now, we kind of are using a language that is not so familiar to people, and therefore we try to talk about Tisha B'av in a language that people will understand, even though exile is not something we really understand anymore.
So I'm going to say something rather radical, even for Madlik disruptive Torah. And it's really going to be the premise of the rest of our discussion today. And that is that, we Jews, lovers of Israel today, are always asking the question, why, when you criticize the Jews or when you criticize Israel, do you question its right to exist? Why can't you criticize us like anybody else? There are plenty of progressives who are critical of the way the U.S. operates in Afghanistan or how it treats minorities in this country. Never do they say, and therefore you have no right to live there. Why is it always Israel that we question the right to exist? And what I want to say that is slightly radical is here, and I want to pick up on what you were saying a second ago, Rabbi, here the lever that we introduce to the world is if we are bad, we become stateless. And we introduced this concept that we are unique and that our connection with the land and our political autonomy is tenuous and contingent. And I think that we always throw up our hands, us lovers of Israel, and they go, why are they treating us differently? And what I would like to kind of explore for the rest is so many of the tropes of anti-Semitism actually are the flip side of the arguments that we are seeing in our own tradition. And I'm starting with this argument that if you Jews are bad, you're going to be kicked out of your land.
Right. Okay. And do you think that resonates with people today?
So I think for me to make that argument, I've got to drill down and continue, because
I think so, right. So I want to hear the rest of the argument.
Yeah, because I do agree with you that it's fairly sophisticated to say, oh yeah, most people living on this planet know about the second paragraph of Shema, where it says, if you don't behave, we're going to kick you out of the country. So let's delve into this a little bit deeper. My guess would be that if I asked the typical knowledgeable Jew about why the temple was destroyed, specifically the second temple, they might tell me a story about two guys named Kamsa. They might go into the Talmud and look for all of the reasons that different rabbis have given through the ages for why we lost the temple and the land. And I can assure you that not one of the answers given by those rabbis, I would say authentic or practical, because I believe the reason that the temple was destroyed is because we got in the way of the Roman Empire. That's the long and the short of it. It wasn't about me. It wasn't about you. It was about the fact that Israel is somehow between Babylonia and Rome. And in the first temple, we got in the way of the Babylonian Empire. And in the second, we got in the front of Rome. And I will ask that question, but the rest of my argument is going to be that we were very successful in teaching the world the perspective that we Jews have that does relate our condition to our moral and religious adherence. And that everybody who was a follower of Christianity and a follower of Islam is aware.
Good. I think that and so there is an awareness of this kind of punishment. And it's a religious awareness of this kind of punishment. It's not political, it's religious.
Yes. I think
that's an important distinction, I think.
So there's two books and two thinkers that I want to really rely on. And one is Ruth Weiss, a professor, I believe, at Harvard, who wrote a book called Jews in Power. And the other is Yitz Greenberg. But let's start with Ruth Weiss. The premise of her book is exactly the question that I just asked, which is, how did this happen? How did this become so persuasive? And she starts with Josephus Flavius. Now, Josephus Flavius was a Jew who moved over to the Roman side. And he asks, why was the temple destroyed? And he gives a bunch of reasons. And one of those reasons even refers to what caused the Romans to purify the temple. Now, I get it. He was on the payroll of the Romans. He was a Roman historian. But he lists, again, just as the rabbis of the Talmud do, a bunch of assassinations that were incurred by sectarian fighting. He talks about all of the corruption that was there. And again, And Josephus was translated into every language of the civilized world. He and the rabbis were literally on the same page in terms of when, and this is a quote, when the Romans came to purify thee from thy internal pollution. So it's really, and if you understand what the ramifications of that is, that not only the rabbis and not only the Romans historians, but ultimately the Jews themselves promulgated this concept that if bad things happen to the Jews, it's because we sinned. I think you can begin to see that, in fact, yes, every one of, I wouldn't even call it the Abrahamic religions. I would call it the secessionist religions, the religions that believed that they replaced the Jews. And that really did feed into their narrative that they replaced the Jews because the Jews had sinned. And proof, evidence number one is look at the Jews. Take a look at that ghetto. Take a look at these people who can't farm the land because we won't permit them to do it. So this, I do believe, there is a direct connection between our perception of what brought on the trauma of Tisha B'av and the world's perception.
I think that that's a really good idea. I think that's a powerful idea. I wonder within, you talk about the secessionist religions. Do the other religions focus on exile the same way? Do Muslims have the idea of exile?
Again, I'd love it if we had a historian and a comparative, either religion or archaeologist or a sociologist here. I think that getting back to the way I began the discussion with the rabbis of the Midrash saying, if the book of Devarim is about rebuke, why not get the enemies of the Jews to mouth that rebuke? I think the knee-jerk reaction is that civilizations are criticized by their enemies. And they are not, at least, and now I'll get into washing one's laundry in public, certainly not publicly are they criticized in the ancient world, in the medieval world, in the world of the Middle Ages. We can talk about modern times later. But no, I don't think that, number one, other religious cultures are so self-critical. And to answer your question, I don't believe, especially because Christianity and maybe Islam too, we're not as rooted in a particular locality or location. But certainly, even if one gets away from the location, it's really the destruction of the temple was more than just exile from a particular piece of land. It was, the end of the temple culture. It was, for a large degree, the end of a language. I believe that Rome even changed the name from Judea to Palestinia just to literally make Israel Jew-free. So I don't believe, and I'd be curious to know
if... It was the end of an idea. I always say it that way, the end of an idea. Jewish autonomy, as reflected in the temple, was a religious idea. We have been working for the past 2,000 years to restore that idea. The prayer service, what we call davening, is an attempt to restore what we lost on that day in the year 70 when there was no longer a temple. How do you get back that idea of connecting to place and to God without something? And that's why we've had that was what the prayer service did. Instead of sacrifices, we had a prayer service. We had this idea of 3 times a day. We had this idea of synagogue. Synagogue's a new idea. Synagogue really only came about after the destruction of the temple, because when there was a temple, you weren't allowed to have synagogues, because the synagogue was the temple. But once there was no more temple, then all of a sudden they created synagogues. So we've been trying to restore that idea. Now, I think, Geoffrey, it would be an interesting conversation maybe for another time, and to say, did we do a good job? Because I would make the argument we've done an amazing job. That we actually have replaced that idea, that it's not the same as having a temple, but we have done very well in terms of unifying the Jewish people. And I think Tisha B'av is an example of that. The fact that Jews around the world know that it's Tisha B'av, whether they fast or they don't fast, but they know that it's Tisha B'av. They know that it's Rosh Hashanah. They know that it's Yom Kippur. Means the idea is maintained.
So I think that you make a compelling argument for the fact that the rabbinical response actually was greatly beneficial, and the proof is in the pudding. We survived for 2,000 years of exile. Again, as long as we're talking about what makes the experience of the Jewish people unique, you can't say that about a lot of cultures or religions. So I would like to segue and use your question to segue a little bit away from Ruth Weiss and into Yitz Greenberg. Ruth Weiss is actually a conservative thinker, and she is very into realpolitik, and as her book progresses, and I really think anyone who's interested in the subject should read it. She's very critical. She writes at the beginning of her book that her book is against the tendency of Jews to seek fault in themselves as part of a harmful pattern I hope to expose. So the whole purpose of her book, and she will look at a statement that you just made now, which is, well, we survived, didn't we? She would critique that as the pacifism that we survived for 2,000 years, bending over like Fiddler on the Roof, saying this too will pass, is what kept us in exile so long. But I want to go to a religious thinker. And Yitz Greenberg believes that if there were two epochs of Judaism before the Holocaust, meaning when we were in the land, then after we were expelled, that literally turned Judaism on a dime. I think that one of the things that you were just saying a second ago is that the paradigm shift that Judaism went through after the temple was destroyed was just unheard of in the history of religion and of society. The rabbis literally changed the face of Judaism. And Yitz Greenberg believes that the Holocaust is a similar episode. It is the third epoch in Judaism. And he argues that those who say that, well, you know, it's bad, but look at all the other bad things that have happened to us. He points to instances such as the Spanish Inquisition that created the Kabbalah. He focuses on the Shabtai Tzvi and the false Messiah as that something that totally created the Hasidic movement and all that. So we do have to react, and we do have to change Judaism. But in his case, the Holocaust is on a different level. And what he argues is that after the Holocaust, we can no longer follow, and here he's in agreement with Ruth Weiss, and he's also in agreement with you. The type of Judaism that enabled us to survive, to get through it, to persevere under great odds, no longer worked. He argues that without the state of Israel, there would probably have been another 2 Holocausts since 1945. His famous phrase is that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and powerlessness is worse than all. And he makes a very compelling argument that now we have to stop blaming ourselves. We have to take responsibility for our future, that the God of maybe exile was the God who was hidden. The God after the Holocaust is a God who says, you have the keys, you control your own fate, it's all up to you. So it's almost a religious push for the secular to take over the role of that. And again, you should read his work as well. But it's a fascinating turn, and it segues into what you were talking about what you will be talking about tomorrow, Rabbi, in terms of when do we celebrate Tisha B'av. So before we talk about celebrating Tisha B'av, what are your feelings about Yitz Yitz Greenberg's approach, do you feel that the Holocaust changes everything?
I think the Holocaust changed everything. I think the question we have to ask is, and I think that's a question that is really the next chapter in Yitz Greenberg's book, is what's the therefore? So the Holocaust changed everything. The state of Israel changed everything. What are we supposed to do about it? I'll tell you a little story. In the service on Tisha B'av, in the afternoon service, the Mincha service, there's a paragraph that we recite on Tisha B'av. It's the only time we say it the whole year long. Mincha on Tisha B'av. It's called Nachem. And it says God should console us. And in Nachem, we talk about a Jerusalem that is destroyed. And many of the rabbis in Israel, Yitz Greenberg included, he changes the entire language of this paragraph. This paragraph talks about, and the city that is in sorrow, laid waste, scorned and desolate, that grieves for the loss of its children, that is laid waste of its dwellings, robbed of its glory, desolate without inhabitants. I don't know, Geoffrey, the last time you were at the Waldorf in Jerusalem, but that is not a description of the Waldorf in Jerusalem. And these rabbis have taken out that paragraph. And they basically said that that's just not true anymore. That the Holocaust changed everything, but we have to realize that that the traditions, the way that traditionally Tisha B'av has been looked at, is just not true anymore. And we have to be willing to recognize that. I'll just tell you one more story. Rabbi David Hartman, famous Rabbi David Hartman, before he moved to Israel, was a rabbi in Montreal. In 1967, it was a Six-Day War. Israel reconquered Jerusalem in June. That Tisha B'av, the tradition is that David Hartman, in the afternoon of Tisha B'av, took his family on a picnic because he said, we can't fast the whole day. Tisha B'av is just not the way Tisha B'av used to be anymore. We can't have Jerusalem and still observe Tisha B'av the same way. I think those ideas are very powerful ideas.
So, Rabbi, as usual, you created a great segue for me to finish up. But I think what everybody is kind of echoing is that even the rabbis of the Talmud understood. In Ta'anit they say, whoever mourns for Jerusalem will merit to see her future glory. In the tractate of Rosh Hashanah, it says that when there will be peace, that all of the fast days that are associated with the destruction of the temple will be feast days that you won't be able to have a funeral on. You won't be able to do anything related to mourning, which seems kind of strange until you couch it slightly differently. Whereas on Tisha B'av, we mourn our powerlessness. On Tisha B'av that is commemorated after we have our own state and after we have power without putting any silver coating on power. Power is a responsibility, but we can celebrate our power as we mourned our powerlessness. And I think that's why we do have to start considering segueing from a Tisha B'av of mourning, where we mourn our powerlessness, to a Tisha B'av of celebration, where we celebrate respectfully our ability to control our own destiny and to take the future into our own hands.
Thank you. I think that's beautiful. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Have an easy and a meaningful fast. And we look forward, Geoffrey, to many years of celebrating Tisha B'av in a smart and productive way, the way Yitz Greenberg talks about it.
Amen. Shabbat Shalom to you all.
Stay well. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Bye-bye.